Architecture. So Spark architecture is consists of basically driver and executor. Driver is act as a master process, and executor act as a slave process. It's a like MapReduce. We are going to cover here what is the Spark design, how the Spark design, and information about the driver, and what is a Spark executor, and cluster manager and execution modes. Example cluster mode and client mode. So let's start with the Spark design. So Spark is a distributed parallel processing framework, MBS, with many similarity to traditional MapReduce framework. Spark has the same leader worker architecture as MapReduce. Leader process, coordinate, and distribute work to perform among the workers. So it's similar to in your typically teams. It's like you get the work from the client or business user, then leader will take and he'll assign to the developer. So developer is here. Developer is a executor and leader is driver. So let's understand how the driver work in a Spark. So driver is the leader process that manages executor of the Spark jobs. It's responsible for maintaining overall structure of Spark application, responding to user program or input, analyzing, distributing, and scheduling work among executor process. A driver process is the essence, the heart of the Spark application, maintain all application related information during application of life. So driver is just, you understand, it's your team leader. Now driver convert Spark operations. We have Spark operation that into DAG. DAG we call previous session. If you go my previous session, DAG is a direct acyclic graph. Computation and scheduling distributes to them as a task across the Spark executor. Spark driver access that distributed component into cluster, including executor, cluster manager via Spark session. So Spark session is the entry point of Spark. So in my coming lecture, I will teach what is the Spark session. You can consider the Spark session to single point of entry Spark session, access to all Spark operation and the data. Through Spark session we can read from data source, write data frame or data sets, create runtime JVM. So in essence, Spark session are unified conduit to all Spark functionality. If you are using interface Spark Shell, so Spark can run using interactive Spark Shell in a Spark driver. A Spark session for us, whereas if you are using a Spark application, we will create a Spark session to ourselves. We will look at some example. So basically it's a we learn here what is that Spark, how the Spark is designed, parallel processing, and what is the driver do. It's similar to your team leads. So next part is the executor. This is very important part also in the Spark component. Executor is a worker process that executes code assigned to them by driver process and respond state of computation on the executor back to the driver. So it just process and give result to back to the driver. Once the resource has been allocated, driver directly communicate with the executor. Most deployment modes, single executor run on per nodes. Spark execute are assigned to tasks that require working on subset of data located closest to them. So executor will look the data closer to that nodes which executor is running on that node. Worker on the data close approximately refer to the data locality. It helps reduce consumption of network bandwidth. Now the next part we are going to discuss about cluster manager. So what is cluster manager? A MapReduce or a Spark job run on a cluster of machines. So MapReduce and those run on the cluster of machines. MapReduce application master or Spark driver process don't have authority or ability to allocate cluster resource for a job. So in case of MapReduce, in case of Spark, cluster they don't have authority to allocate the resource, so they will go to third part, different software. So that's we are going to discuss here. Instead of there another piece of software that manages physical resource of cluster and arbitrate them among the jobs, usually based on some user-defined policy. Spark driver has to negotiate resources with the cluster managers to launch executable process. Yarn is one of such example of cluster managers software. So the Yarn will do for the Spark. Spark is compatible with the following cluster manager. So there are various cluster manager, but Spark, the driver will deal with the local mode. First one, built-in stand-alone cluster manager, Hadoop Yarn, Kubernetes, Apache Mouse. So these are 5 things. Local modes, we'll go detail. Built-in stand-alone, Hadoop Yarn, Kubernetes, Apache Mouse. So we'll go into next week. So these are the modes. In local modes, standalone mode, Yarn client, Yarn cluster, and Kubernetes. So Yarn we can run as a client mode, we can run as cluster modes, and local and standalone. So in case of local mode, we talk about here 3 things. Spark driver, what is Spark driver responsibility, what is the Spark executor responsibility, what is the cluster manager responsibility. In case of local mode, runs on the single JVM. So if you know about Java have concept of JVM, Java virtual machine, like laptop. So in case of local, so run single JVM, like your laptop is a single node or single modes. Run on, so in case of Spark driver, what about executor? Executor also run on the same driver, and cluster manager run on the same host. So all 3 reside on same host machine. In case of standalone, it can run any node in a cluster. Standalone means one, so any node of cluster. Each node, so the driver program. In case of standalone, each node is the cluster will launch its own executor. Each nodes will launch their own JVM. Can be allocated with any host of cluster. So in case of standalone, any arbitrary host can consider as a cluster. So that's the difference. Now let's go Yarn client and Yarn cluster. So in case of Yarn cluster, run on client, not part of cluster. So driver will run on the client machine. In case of the cluster mode, runs in case of Yarn will run on top of the cluster machine. This is the only difference in Spark driver. Spark executor will be same. Yarn node manager content same Yarn node manager, so it will be same. And cluster manager, Yarn resource manager work with the Yarn application master, allocate the container on node arrangements, same. So little bit difference is only Spark driver difference. In case of Kubernetes runs, so the Spark driver will runs on the Kubernetes pod. Spark executor will run each work run within on pod and Kubernetes. So there is a few difference, so you guys understand, or if you want to, I will provide the links of my text. Now next part is a very important part, execution modes. So what is execution mode? It's a kind of the deployment jobs in the Spark. So there are 2 deployment mode in which Spark can execute. Deploy mode refers to location where a Spark driver program will run. So the driver can run either your cluster or outside the cluster. There are these 2 modes we are going to discuss here, cluster mode and client mode. So in this example, you see the cluster mode. The client machine is here from your laptop. You are submitting the Spark job. So when you start a Spark job, there is a command called Spark submit. Then it will go to the resource manager, and resource manager will talk to the application master or AM container. Then AM container will so application master is consists of the AM container and Spark driver. So then if have resource, then it will allocate, and the Spark driver will talk to executor. But if you see this diagram, in case of cluster mode, resource manager is on cluster. So in case of the client, the Spark cell, or it's the Spark driver or Spark cell, whatever it is, client mode it is near to client. Cluster mode it's in cluster. So this is what we are talking. Let's go in detail. So in cluster mode, Spark application like Java, jar file, Python are submitting to cluster manager by user. The manager turn the driver and executor process the worker node executes to the jobs. This setting both driver and executor live inside cluster. That's what we are talking. And here, in case of client modes, similar to cluster mode, except the driver process live on the client machine, use the submit a Spark job outside of cluster. The machine hosting driver process is not clustered on the cluster running executes process. The client machine is responsible for maintaining driver process and cluster is responsible for executor process. So this is the difference. Please likes and subscribe my channel. This is very theory lecture, but it's very important for learning about the Spark architecture and for your interview and for the next job level. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe my channel.